Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Monroe and the focus is Madison's Cabinet and war. The year is 1809 and James Madison is now the fourth president of the United States, and his longtime friend and colleague James Monroe would like to have a seat at the table. He's interested in becoming the Secretary of State, in fact, in a Madison cabinet. The problem is Monroe and Madison are estranged over some foreign policy disagreements in the Jefferson administration, and Monroe blamed Madison for that. Madison didn't like it either, and so they're really not speaking, and there is no offer forthcoming for Monroe to join the cabinet. Well, he does have a couple of other offers. In fact, the state of Virginia wants to send him back to the U.S. Senate. He says, yeah, no, I'm not interested in that. But then they offered him the governorship. He'd already served 3 one-year terms as governor. Well, he'll take a fourth, and he takes that role in 1811. But this time, he only serves for 4 months because the president, his friend James Madison, actually does really need his help. Great Britain and France are at war, and they're taking it out on American shipping. This is a really tough time for the Americans. Jefferson and Madison, during Jefferson's presidency, had used economic means to try to get France and England to back off. That wasn't working. Madison continued these policies in his administration. They're still not working, and there's a lot of calls for war, and frankly, Madison needs better advisors around him. He doesn't like the job that Robert Smith is doing as Secretary of State, so he reaches out to Monroe and says, you know what, come join my cabinet as my Secretary of State. Well, Monroe's going to play a little hard to get because he's still smarting over that treaty he negotiated with Britain that Jefferson and Madison had kind of brushed aside. And so Monroe responds that I was sincerely of opinion after the failure of the negotiation with Spain, or rather France, that it was for the interest of our country to make an accommodation with England, the great maritime power, even on moderate terms, rather than hazard war or any other alternative. On that opinion, I acted afterwards while I remained in office, and I own that I have since seen no cause to doubt its soundness. In other words, I didn't do anything wrong. I did the right thing, and you guys should have paid more attention to that treaty that I negotiated. Well, Madison wasn't going to go that far, but he basically said, look, I have an open mind. If you want to come in with your opinions about how to deal with France or Britain, great. Come on in. Well, with that, Monroe was happy, signed on as Secretary of State. And in fact, within a very short amount of time, he commented that the conduct of the president, since my arrival has corresponded with our ancient relation, which I am happy to have restored. On public affairs, we confer without reserve, each party expressing his own sentiments and viewing dispassionately the existing state, animated by a sincere desire to promote the public welfare. I have full confidence that this relation will always be preserved in future, and in fact it is. He and Madison are tight again, and they would remain that way for the rest of their lives. Now, the United States, though, is still not in good terms with either Britain or France, and they're trying to figure out whether or not they should go to war, and if so, with which one, or potentially both. It's the summer of 1812, and Madison actually adds up. Nearly 1,000 American ships have been seized by either the British or the French over the last several years. This is getting out of control. The economic models aren't working. Maybe war is necessary. And that's the camp that James Monroe was leading into. He said to a friend in England, war, dreadful as the alternative is, could not do us more injury than the present state of things, and it would certainly be more honorable to the nation and gratifying to the public feelings. Honor. We had a previous episode about James Monroe standing up for his personal honor. Well, this was him doing it on behalf of his country. At this point, there was not much else that the Americans could do to stop the British and French against their dishonorable conduct toward the United States, and it was incumbent upon the Americans to actually stand up for themselves, and it was with that mindset that President Madison asked for a declaration of war. The question was going to be, is this going to be with France or with England? He settles on England. Why? The difference? 2 things. Impressment. We talked about this in a previous episode where British sailors would capture American ships, identify people through their own interests to say, you're really a British citizen, you're a British citizen, I'm kidnapping you, you have to go now work in the British Navy. And they did this a lot. And France was not doing that particular kind of action. Also, the British were going to their Indian allies in the Northwest Territory of North America and encouraged them to attack the American settlers. And so for those 2 reasons, it was a focus on the British for the War of 1812. Now, James Monroe actually wanted a military job. He had been a soldier, of course, in the Revolutionary War, had been injured and actually in the Battle of Trenton, and survived and served honorably for about a year and a half in his service, and he now wanted to go back, be a general, be in charge, and help command some troops in battle. James Madison said, no, I need you here as my right hand. I need you in the cabinet. But he did decide to make some changes in the cabinet. William Eustis had been his Secretary of War. He doesn't have confidence in him in a war footing. And so Madison brings in John Armstrong into the cabinet as Secretary of War, which is probably a mistake. Armstrong had his own ambitions. He wanted to be president. He wasn't going to be a team player. Monroe is clearly Madison's main ally in the cabinet, but now he's got Armstrong at the table as well. Well, the battles in the War of 1812 are actually few and far between. Each side picks up some victories here and there, nothing really decisive, but there is a battle of note because it has impacts down the road on the American capital. And it's what happens in the Upper Canada capital of the city of York. The Americans capture York. It's not really a big military target, but they do capture it. It's the capital of Upper Canada, and they go a bit too far. They burn Parliament buildings, they do a lot of looting, and the British are not happy. British are not acting upon that because they're still busy fighting their war with France. So the British have wars on both fronts, but things change in March of 1814. The British defeat Napoleon and their war in Europe is over. They can now send a whole bunch of ships and sailors and soldiers to North America to do battle with the Americans and try to clean up that war. And where do they set their sights? The American capital. They want revenge for York, and so they go after Washington, D.C. Now, the Americans are completely unprepared. Secretary Armstrong and Brigadier General William Winder, who's responsible for that part of the country's defense, were saying they're never going to come here. This is not a military target, but they just really didn't see how badly Britain wanted revenge for what the Americans had done in Canada. So by the time that the redcoats or the British soldiers are spotted in and around Washington, the Americans really have to scramble, and James Monroe is one of them. He gets on his horse, he goes out, and he actually starts positioning troops. The Americans set up their line at Bladensburg Road in Maryland, and Monroe is out there trying to help out the best he can. But there's not much they can do. The American defense is paltry. They're immediately overrun. The British then race into Washington, D.C. They burn the city. They burn the Capitol building. They burn the executive mansion. And this is a low point for the Americans in this war. Well, in the wake of that, Secretary Armstrong resigns before he can be fired. And James Monroe takes on a new job, a pretty rare double-double. He picks up acting Secretary of War and Secretary of State on behalf of his president, James Madison. And one of the first things he does is he complains to the British. He says, you shouldn't have done that to us about burning the Capitol. He said, in the course of 10 years past, the capitals of the principal powers of the continent of Europe have been conquered and occupied alternatively by the victorious armies of each other, and no instance of such wanton and unjustifiable destruction has been seen. Well, these comments to British Admiral Alexander Cochrane completely fall on deaf ears because all they have to do is say, look, you did it to us in Canada, we just did it to you to take our revenge, so really you have nothing to complain about. Well, in terms of Monroe's role now, he is acting Secretary of War, still trying to help Madison oversee the battles on the ground, but he's really focused more on trying to generate peace. And for that, he and Madison have selected an all-star cast to negotiate over in Europe. He's got John Quincy Adams, the veteran diplomat and son of the former president, as the chair of this commission. He's also got Speaker of the House Henry Clay, representing the Western interests. He's got Albert Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury, and a couple of others. They're in Ghent in Belgium to go negotiate an outcome to end this war. The sticking point, impressment. Up to this point, the Americans were adamant, we are not going to end this war until the British take impressment off the table in the treaty. And they absolutely refused to do that. But now the Americans have a different mindset. Why? Because the war in Europe with France is over. So the Americans realize that, look, they can officially keep impressment on the table as a policy if they want, but they're not going to be impressing anybody because they don't have any need for it. They don't need all these new recruits into their navy to go fight France or other wars in Europe. So let's take a shot. Let's take impressment off the table, see if we can get peace. We don't think they're going to impress our folks anymore because they just don't need to, and this will get us the outcome that we're looking for, and everybody can sort of save face in the process. So Monroe communicates this to the commissioners. He says that you may omit any stipulation on the subject of impressment if found indispensably necessary to terminate it. Now, you will, of course, not recur to this expedient until all your efforts to adjust the controversy in a more satisfactory manner have failed. Well, they had already failed. They were going to continue to fail, and so they went straight to these new instructions, and then negotiations to end the war happened pretty quickly. In fact, it was December 24th, Christmas Eve, on 1814, that the Treaty of Ghent was signed, and what did they decide? Basically a draw. Status quo ante bellum, they called it. We'll go back to the way things were before the war. No land swaps, no indemnity. We're just going to end this thing peacefully and go back about our business. But the interesting thing for the Americans is, while the British kind of saw it as, okay, it's a draw, no big deal, the Americans saw this as a big deal. This was a point of pride for the Americans. Why? Because they didn't lose. And they stood up to the British, the mighty British with their big army and their navy. And this is the second time the Americans, this upstart colonial foundation and new nation, have stood up to the mighty British. Actually, this little war helped really grow the pride of the American people. The other thing it did is it completely obliterated the opposition political party, the Federalists, who had already begun to fracture under the John Adams administration. Well, now it totally disintegrates because a lot of Federalists, especially in the northeastern part of the country, were against the war. They were really public against the war. And now that the Americans had sort of had this draw, they had a big military victory at New Orleans at the end of the war, the Americans are feeling really good about themselves and not very good about the Federalists. Well, so what does this mean for the next presidential election coming up in 1816? Well, it's an opportunity for someone else to step in from the Democratic Republican Party. For that, though, that's a story for another day. For now, that is James Monroe and Madison's Cabinet and War from the life of James Monroe. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.